weapon. If they had, because they're crazy, just like the people on my right. We were having negotiations with these lunatics, and it was my opinion that they were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first. I felt strongly about that. And we have great negotiators, great people that do this very successfully and have done it all their lives very successful. And based on the way the negotiation was going, I think they were going to attack first. And I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand. Let me say that I've been saying for 25 years, even as a civilian, you cannot let them have a nuclear weapon. And that's what happened. It's been obliterated. It would be years before they could ever get going. And I really think it's probably the last thing. They have to recover from a hell of a tough war.
Would you also be demanding that the IAEA have full rights to inspect in Iran?
Or somebody, or somebody that we respect, including ourselves.
So the U.S.-Israeli attacks are clearly illegal. There's really no doubt about it. And the reason why there's no doubt about it is that the only justification that the U.S. and Israel could use to justify their use of force on Iran is self-defense. And self-defense, which is set out in Article 51 of the UN Charter, requires either for Iran to have committed an ongoing armed attack on Israel or the United States, or, and this is sort of debated, but in the most generous kind of way, or for Iran to imminently about to be committing an armed attack on Israel and the United States. And there's simply no evidence that Iran was imminently going to attack either country by nuclear weapons or otherwise.
The mission of Operation Epic Fury is laser-focused. Destroy Iranian offensive missiles, destroy Iranian missile production, destroy their navy and other security infrastructure, and they will never have nuclear weapons.
And you can see this, by the way, from the shifting stories, for example, the United States administration, right? So on one day they say Iran was going, in a few days or a few weeks was going to have an ICBM that could hit the United States, which is obviously not true, right? Every intelligence assessment that's out there says that Iran was years away from building that type of long-range missile capability that could, for example, hit the United States. On another day, yesterday, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, basically said, well, we knew the Israelis were going to attack Iran no matter what we did. And then we thought Iran was definitely going to attack us. So that's why we decided to attack Iran first, which is just a circular logic that makes absolutely no sense. If you knew that Israel was going to attack Iran, you were supposed to constrain Israel.
And so the president made the very wise decision. We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
What we're seeing now is not the self-defense of Israel and the United States. It is an attack by Israel and the United States on Iran. I understand that Israel in particular sees a grave threat in the Iranian leadership. That's perfectly sensible, right? What simply international law does not allow is to use war to resolve these kinds of disputes when there are many other options on the table. And in fact, the current president, President Trump, scuppered the kind of diplomatic deal that was already in place to constrain, in particular, Iran's nuclear ambitions. So it's really very difficult to see. And in fact, I don't see any serious international lawyer arguing that these attacks are lawful.
Mr. President, this morning the United States regime jointly and in coordination with the Israeli regime initiated an unprovoked and premeditated aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran for the second time in the recent months, while deliberately attacking civilian populated areas in multiple large cities of Iran where millions of people reside. As a result of this brutal armed attack, hundreds of civilians have been killed and injured.
Right? So Iran, in response to the attack against it, has decided to attack its neighbors rather than to simply defend itself to the extent it can from Israel and the United States. Now, what that means is that those states now have the right to defend themselves from Iran. They also have the right to invite other states like the UK and France, and even arguably even the United States, to help them defend themselves from Iran in collective self-defense. For other individuals, there's a bit of an issue, right? It is kind of complicated. This includes the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, but also some of his advisors. It includes the Minister of Defense. It includes people who are officials who do military intelligence, for example, for the Military Intelligence Agency, but they're themselves civilians. Now, for most of these people, my sense is that the United States and Israel can plausibly argue that they are direct participants in hostilities. Why? Because they made, historically at least, they made many decisions which are about the conduct tactically and operationally of military operations. So Khamenei would, personally approve certain uses of force. By the way, that also applies to Israeli and American officials. So the American president, the American Secretary of Defense, they're in my view civilians, quite clearly. So is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. But they frequently, routinely make operational military decisions, and that means they're directly participating in hostilities and could be targeted if Iran had the means to target them. So my personal view is that killing Khamenei and many of his senior military advisors who may have been civilians was lawful as a matter of international humanitarian law, or at least was arguably lawful. You should bear in mind, though, that the fact that civilians are harmed in the course of hostilities does not inevitably mean that these rules were breached. So, for example, when we see that school where more than 150 kids were killed, the fact that these kids died and the school was struck does not inevitably mean, for example, the principle of distinction was violated or that a war crime was committed. It will depend on what the commander who launched the strike knew at the time. And if they made a mistake and genuinely thought they were targeting a military objective, there would, for example, be no war crime. In that particular case, though, there seems to be a pretty patent failure to take all feasible precautions in attack, which is what international humanitarian law requires. And amongst these precautions is to do everything feasible to verify the identity of the target and to minimize the loss of civilian life. From the former Yugoslavia, ultimately the whole leadership of the Serbian state, both political leaders and military leaders, ended up in an international courtroom. No one expected it at the time, but it did happen. So theoretically, there is the possibility that some of these actors, whether states or individuals, will incur a measure of responsibility, sometimes many years down the line. It is also, however, possible, and that's sort of what we're witnessing, that the repeated breaches of the law end up breaking the legal system or end up breaking the foundations of that legal system.